All right, so you're here because you really want to understand complex things, right? You want to get to the core of it all. And that's what we're all about today. We've got a ton of info here, a whole stack of it, actually, and we're going to take a deep dive into Parkinson's disease. But don't worry, we'll give you all the essential insights without, getting too bogged down.
Yeah, exactly. Think of it like you're like a curated guide,
Right.
to understanding Parkinson's disease, what it is, where it comes from, how it shows up, and how we can deal with it. We want to make sure you walk away with the really crucial knowledge.
Yeah. And just to kick things off, did you know that it's estimated that like around 1% of everyone over 65 in the US is living with Parkinson's? That's kind of a lot, right? So let's dive right in. What exactly is Parkinson's disease?
So Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative disorder. And what's really interesting is that it involves the loss of specific brain cells. These are called dopaminergic neurons, and they're found in a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. Now, another thing we often see is the presence of these things called Lewy bodies inside these neurons. Now, one thing that's important to clarify right off the bat is the difference between Parkinson's disease and, well, this term Parkinsonism.
Oh, yeah, Parkinsonism. I've heard that term thrown around a lot. What's the distinction?
Okay, so Parkinsonism is kind of a broader term. It refers to a bunch of motor symptoms, things like tremors, slowness of movement, and stiffness. All of these symptoms stem from problems in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. Think of the basal ganglia as like the brain's control center for fine-tuning our movements. So when it's not working right, movements can become jerky, slow, uncoordinated, and that's what we see in Parkinsonism. While Parkinson's disease is the most common cause of Parkinsonism, other things can lead to these same symptoms, like brain tumors or problems with blood vessels in the brain, like after a stroke, and even repeated head trauma.
So Parkinson's is one specific type of Parkinsonism, right? And this is something that usually develops later in life.
You got it. Parkinson's disease usually starts in later adulthood, with the average age of onset being around 57. And what might start as a subtle slowing down, just a feeling that things are a bit off, gradually worsens over time. And it's actually more common than people might think. Around 60,000 new cases are diagnosed in the U.S. each year.
Wow, that's a lot. So when we talk about what triggers this whole process, it kind of feels like we're still putting the puzzle together. What have we learned from our sources about the possible causes?
That's a good point. We haven't yet found a single definitive cause for Parkinson's. But current research points to a complex interplay between things in our environment and our own genes. Scientists are really digging deep into the biological processes that might lead to the breakdown of those important neurons we talked about. For instance, they're looking into oxidative stress, which is basically an imbalance between free radicals and antioxidants in the body. And they're also investigating mitochondrial dysfunction, meaning problems with the parts of our cells that produce energy. Both of these are being heavily investigated as possible contributors to the damage of these neurons.
It's interesting because our sources mention some risk factors that seem a little counterintuitive at first glance.
Right. The data suggests that people who smoke cigarettes and drink coffee actually have a lower risk of developing Parkinson's. Isn't that wild? But then on the other hand, it seems like living in rural areas, particularly those with a history of pesticide use, might actually increase the risk. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Mm.
Now, while these associations are super intriguing, it's crucial to remember that correlation doesn't automatically equal causation. Researchers are still working hard to figure out if these factors directly contribute to Parkinson's or if there are other underlying reasons for these patterns. For example, some early research suggests that certain components in tobacco smoke might actually have a protective effect on neurons, although it's absolutely essential to emphasize the overwhelming negative health effects of smoking overall.
Definitely makes you wonder about what's really happening at a deeper level. It's clearly not a simple cause and effect situation. So let's zoom in a bit on the how. What are the key processes happening in the brain at the cellular level that are driving Parkinson's?
One of the main culprits seems to be the buildup of a protein called alpha-synuclein in certain parts of the brain, especially in the substantia nigra. This abnormal accumulation is thought to be a major player in the dysfunction and eventual death of those dopamine-producing neurons. There's even a theory that those Lewy bodies we talked about, which contain this misfolded alpha-synuclein, might actually be the cell's way of trying to deal with these problematic proteins, although ultimately it ends up harming the cell.
And dopamine is crucial for controlling movement, right?
Absolutely. As we mentioned earlier, the substantia nigra is a key part of the basal ganglia, which is like the brain's movement coordinator. So when those dopamine-producing neurons die off, The brain's ability to regulate smooth and efficient movement is directly impaired. This disruption in the dopamine signaling pathway is really a central problem in Parkinson's.
Our sources also talk about a genetic component. How big of a role do our genes play in developing Parkinson's?
Genetics definitely have a part to play. Researchers have found about 20 different genes that can be involved in Parkinson's, and these genes can be passed down through families in either dominant or recessive patterns. But does that mean Parkinson's is mostly a hereditary disease? Not really. While these genetic links are important, they probably account for a relatively small percentage of all Parkinson's cases. It's actually more common for Parkinson's to develop without a clear family history, which suggests that the interaction with environmental factors is often the key. And it's worth noting that there are some specific genetic syndromes that can also lead to the development of Parkinsonism.
So it's this complex interplay, maybe like genetics loading the gun and then something in the environment pulling the trigger in some cases. Now, let's say someone is in the early stages of developing Parkinson's. What are the first signs they might notice or that their loved ones might pick up on? How does it actually manifest?
The core motor symptoms are usually what we think of when we hear about Parkinson's: tremor, rigidity, and bradykinesia. And our source emphasizes that bradykinesia, that slowness of movement, is often a key feature.
Let's break those down a bit. Tremor is probably the most well-known symptom. What are some of the telltale signs of the Parkinsonian tremor?
The tremor usually starts off subtly, maybe in a hand or a foot. People often describe it as a pill-rolling tremor because it can look like someone's rolling a small object between their thumb and forefinger. This tremor can gradually spread to other parts of the body, like the neck, face, lips, even the tongue and jaw. It often begins on one side of the body, but it can eventually affect both sides. Now, here's a really important point. Tremors aren't always there when someone is first diagnosed with Parkinson's.
That's good to know it's not a defining initial symptom for everyone. And you mentioned bradykinesia as a central feature. How does this slowness of movement actually affect daily life?
Bradykinesia is more than just moving slowly. It's actually about having trouble starting and carrying out movements you want to make. It can make everyday tasks that we all take for granted, like getting dressed, buttoning clothes, walking, even just getting up from a chair, much harder and much more time-consuming. It can even affect facial expressions, leading to what's often described as a mask-like appearance.
And then there's rigidity. What does that feel like for someone experiencing it?
Rigidity is this stiffness and inflexibility in the limbs and torso. Muscles feel tight and resistant to movement throughout their entire range of motion. This stiffness can be painful and uncomfortable, and it can make it hard to stand and move around. It often feels kind of like a cogwheel turning, that kind of jerky resistance.
Our info also mentions problems with walking, gait disturbance, as something that can happen. How does Parkinson's affect how someone walks?
Yeah, changes in the way someone walks are common, especially as the disease progresses. This can show up as shuffling steps, not swinging their arms as much while walking, and a tendency to lean forward. People with Parkinson's might also experience freezing of gait, which is where they suddenly feel like their feet are glued to the floor, making it hard to start or keep walking. These gait problems greatly increase the risk of falls.
So, besides these more obvious motor symptoms, are there other non-movement related things that people with Parkinson's might experience?
Absolutely. We're learning more and more about the big impact of non-motor symptoms. Our source mentions physical things like excessive sweating and drooling. But even more concerning is cognitive dysfunction. People can have trouble with memory, attention, and executive function, those higher-level thinking skills. And sadly, a significant number of people with Parkinson's, about 20% according to our info, can develop severe dementia. These cognitive changes can be incredibly challenging, both for the individual and for those caring for them.
That really paints a picture of how far-reaching this condition is, going way beyond just movement difficulties. So let's say someone is experiencing these kinds of symptoms. How do doctors go about figuring out if it's Parkinson's? What does the diagnostic process involve?
It's important to understand that, as we talked about earlier, there's no single blood test or brain scan that can give a definite diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. Doctors rely heavily on a person's medical history and a thorough physical and neurological exam. They're looking for that specific combination of motor symptoms we've been discussing, the tremor, rigidity, bradykinesia, and sometimes postural instability. The way these symptoms appear and progress over time is really important.
It sounds like ruling out other possible causes is a crucial part of the diagnosis.
Exactly. Doctors have to make sure they're not missing other conditions that could look like Parkinson's. For instance, some medications, especially antipsychotics, can sometimes cause drug-induced Parkinsonism, which has very similar motor symptoms. So carefully reviewing a person's medication history is essential. Other neurodegenerative diseases that might have some overlapping symptoms also need to be considered and ruled out through clinical evaluation. Sometimes doctors will even try giving a patient levodopa, the main medication for Parkinson's, to see if it helps improve their symptoms, which can further support the diagnosis.
So it's mostly a clinical diagnosis based on careful observation and eliminating other possibilities. Once Parkinson's is diagnosed, what are the current approaches to managing it?
The primary treatment is medication, and the cornerstone of that is levodopa, which we talked about earlier. It's a precursor to dopamine, meaning the brain can convert it into dopamine, helping to replace what's been lost. And it's almost always given with carbidopa.
What's the main reason for using carbidopa in this combination therapy?
Carbidopa is crucial because it makes levodopa work better. It does this by blocking an enzyme that breaks down levodopa in the bloodstream before it even gets to the brain. This means more levodopa can cross the blood-brain barrier and get converted into dopamine right where it's needed. Carbidopa also helps reduce some of the common side effects of levodopa, things like nausea and vomiting, because those are often caused by the levodopa that doesn't reach the brain.
Our sources also mention dopamine agonists as another type of medication used for treatment. How do these compare to levodopa?
Dopamine agonists work a bit differently. They directly stimulate dopamine receptors in the brain, basically mimicking the effects of dopamine. These are sometimes used as the first treatment, particularly in younger folks, and they might have a lower risk of certain long-term motor complications compared to levodopa, at least initially. However, for many people, they may not be as effective as levodopa in controlling the main motor symptoms.
So it seems like these medications can provide significant relief from symptoms, at least for a while.
That's generally true. Our sources suggest that these meds, especially levodopa, tend to be most effective in managing Parkinson's symptoms for about 3 to 6 years. After that, they may become less effective, and people might start to have fluctuations in how well the medication works or develop involuntary movements called dyskinesias.
And medication isn't the only way to manage Parkinson's, right?
Definitely not. Effective management involves a multi-pronged approach. Other medications can be used to target specific symptoms that come along with Parkinson's. For example, SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, can be prescribed to manage anxiety and depression, which are common in people with Parkinson's. Medications like modafinil can help with excessive daytime sleepiness, and something as simple as polyethylene glycol can help manage constipation, another frequent non-motor symptom. And importantly, non-drug therapies are really crucial too. Physical therapy is super important for improving balance, strength, flexibility, and overall mobility, which can help reduce the risk of falls. Occupational therapy can help people adapt their daily activities to stay independent, and speech therapy can address problems with voice and swallowing.
It's a very integrated approach to address all the different aspects of the disease. Looking ahead, what are some of the challenges and potential complications that people with Parkinson's might face in the long term?
Sadly, there are a number of complications that can develop as Parkinson's progresses. Our sources highlight the increased risk of depression and dementia, as we discussed earlier. Problems with the larynx can lead to trouble swallowing, which increases the risk of aspiration pneumonia, and it can also affect voice quality. Autonomic dysfunction can cause problems with things like blood pressure regulation, bowel and bladder control, and other involuntary bodily functions. And postural changes, like kyphosis, which is a forward rounding of the upper back, can also develop.
It sounds like the impact on overall function and independence can be significant.
Unfortunately, the data suggests that most people with Parkinson's experience significant disability within about 10 years of being diagnosed. And the mortality rate for people with Parkinson's is, sadly, roughly 3 times higher than for the general population of a similar age. This really highlights the serious and progressive nature of this condition.
That's a sobering reality. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Parkinson's disease, what would you say are the most important things our listeners should take away?
To sum it up, the key points to remember are that Parkinson's disease is a complex neurodegenerative condition. We haven't yet pinpointed a single definitive cause, but it likely arises from a combination of genetic predisposition and environmental factors. It's characterized by the gradual loss of dopamine-producing neurons in the brain and the buildup of the protein alpha-synuclein. This leads to a range of motor symptoms, like tremor, rigidity, and bradykinesia, as well as various non-motor symptoms, such as cognitive decline and problems with autonomic functions. Diagnosing Parkinson's is primarily based on a clinical evaluation. And while we don't yet have a cure, there are a number of treatments, both medications and non-drug therapies, that can help manage symptoms and improve quality of life. That being said, there can be significant challenges and complications that arise over time.
Even though there's still a lot more research to be done, having a good grasp of the underlying mechanisms, the diverse ways Parkinson's can manifest, and the current treatment strategies is really crucial, not just for people living with Parkinson's, but for their families and communities as well. Considering how genetics and the environment are intertwined, what avenues of research do you think hold the most promise for finally unlocking the secrets of what causes Parkinson's? And could lifestyle interventions play an even bigger role in prevention than we currently understand? There's certainly a lot to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We encourage you to keep learning about this important and constantly evolving field.